Is this headline the same as no straight white men were hired? Or
No.
they had a policy of not hiring straight white men? Wait, I'm just so curious. Do you understand the difference between somebody not being hired because they're white? Because they're
What is going on, everyone? Welcome back to the channel. And today we are getting straight into it. So we have a liberal commentator sitting across from a self-described centrist who spends a lot of time talking about wokeism, mass immigration, and the cultural decline of Britain. And what starts as a structured debate very quickly becomes something far more personal, because the liberal does something most people in these debates never bother to do. He stops the whole conversation and asks one simple question: define your terms. And from that moment forward, nothing the conservative says lands the way he planned. By the time we get to the end of this clip, one of these two men is going to be holding a headline that completely betrays the argument he just spent 10 minutes building, and the look on his face when he realizes it says everything. Stay with this one all the way through, because the final moment is the kind of thing you will want to rewatch. While you are watching, drop a comment and let me know where in the world you are tuning in from. Honestly, one of my favorite parts of running this channel is seeing how far this community reaches. All right, let us get into it.
that you voted Remain for Brexit. Do you think that was a good vote? Do you think you should have remained, or do you think Brexit was a mistake?
I don't regret my vote for Remain, no.
Do you think Brexit was a mistake?
I think it had its negatives and positives, yeah.
Are you sure you're not running for a political party right now? Because that was the most politician answer I've ever heard in my life. Do you think that on net was Brexit a mistake?
Every decision has trade-offs that are positive and negative.
Remember what I said earlier about saying words that mean nothing? Obviously, this is true. But I'm asking, do you think that Brexit on net, was it a mistake?
I think a lot of people think that Brexit ruined the economy.
I'm not asking what a lot of people think. I'm asking you on net. Do you think that Brexit was a mistake?
I think it had some things that made things worse, and I think it had some that...
If you were God and you could choose whether or not the UK voted 51% Brexit or 49% Brexit, what would you push the button to have had them vote? 51% they would Brexit, or 49% and then they would remain in the European Union?
I honestly don't know.
Okay, but so the reason why I ask this question is to illustrate. I ask this question to illustrate how frustrating it is when people like you say things like, well, I voted liberal last election, or I voted Remain. Okay, you don't stand by that anymore, though. You constantly do this thing. No, you don't. You constantly do this thing where you come on stage, or you go on your show and you'll say things like, I used to be a liberal, but the liberals have changed so much, or I used to be a left-leaning person. And the left, I know you've tweeted the dumb picture. I know you've done it. They've changed so much, and now I have to identify with the center-right. I've heard you literally say things like Tommy Robinson makes statements to the left on immigration compared to Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama.
He does.
Yeah, okay.
He does.
I've heard you say something like this, right? But then when
That's
I ask,
a fact.
but then you guys say that everybody else has changed, and then I ask you about your past political votes, you won't defend them. So it seems like you're the one that's changed, which is fine, but you should just own that.
I voted Remain for reasons that were entirely different from the reason that most people voted Remain. The reason I voted Remain is I thought that it would weaken Europe's ability to stand up to Russia. I think I've been proven right on that. And I think the division within Europe has made Europe weaker in terms of its ability to stand up to Russia, and I think we've seen that. So in that respect, I think I was right to vote Remain. What I don't agree with is the narrative that a lot of people like to spin, that Brexit ruined the economy. I don't think that's true at all. If you look at the way other European economies are performing, they're performing even worse than the British economy. So my attempt to give you a nuanced answer is not my refusal to stand by my votes. It's an attempt to use my brain and give you a nuanced answer. Now, in terms of final, did you want to wrap up and move on?
Yeah, just final thoughts on this topic. That would be great, guys.
Yeah, so final thoughts on this topic. I would just recap and maybe add one other thing. We have had a level of mass immigration into Britain that has been extremely disruptive over a fairly short period of time, that has created an environment in which major cities in this country are effectively no longer the domain of the native population of this country, which is very disruptive to the people who've lived here. I'm not one of them. I myself am an immigrant, but I totally recognize that that's happened. I think culturally there have been some terrible things that have happened. I mean, the example of terrorism and grooming gangs is just one of them. But the failure of integration more broadly has been a big problem, to the point where you now saw in the by-election in Gorton Denton, the Green candidate campaigning in Urdu, in a foreign language, in a language not of our country, which I think is a signal of the terrible divisiveness that is we are likely to see in other communities or in other constituencies where some communities haven't integrated at all. And I think what that signals is a democracy works when people vote on the ideas that are being offered to them, not the ethnic and religious background of the candidate or the things that they will tell them. And I think you're increasingly seeing that. So all of these things are big worries to me. And of course, a lot of this would have been much easier to manage if we hadn't also at the same time had the doctrine of diversity, inclusion, and multiculturalism, which have, instead of creating a monoculture into which people are encouraged to buy in and integrate, have instead created a society in which people are encouraged to see themselves as members of an individual community, which I think is essentially the end of a democratic process the way we've understood it to this point. So I think these are all terrible developments, and if this continues, it will only get worse.
Thank you.
I mean, we introduced new things, so I don't know. I don't know what the monoculture is.
How many final thoughts are we going to have?
Well, I mean, when we introduce new concepts like DEI was why Liz Truss, helped 700,000 people come to this country from mainly non-EU places. I just don't know how DEI was the policy there from the Tories that enabled all that mass migration. Or when we talk about the monoculture,
you're right,
I don't know about the United Kingdom. I mean, Scottish people don't seem like they share a monoculture with English people. I feel like rural people and city people don't have much of a monoculture. I don't know if they've ever had a monoculture. I know in the United States, we talk all the time about the difference between city slickers and the good old people in the country and doing the farms and everything. But then we're also simultaneously very concerned about demographic change in the cities. But then at every other point, it seems like the country-related people hate the urban-related culture anyway. So yeah, I don't know. It'd be interesting at some point, maybe at some time in your life, if you ever wanted to dive into these issues for real, maybe on your show or with somebody you're more comfortable with who won't challenge you as much. It'd be interesting to hear a conversation about what do these values look like. When you talk about changing culture, and the answer is, well, some people bring crime. That's not culture. That's like changing culture would require you to identify some fundamental aspect of the culture of a country and then and then to point out to how that fundamental aspect is changing. When you say immigrants are coming and a lot of them commit crime, it's not really a real answer. It's not very satisfying. It's not really getting to the heart of the issues. And
Shall we move on to wokeism?
The moment someone refuses to define their own terminology in a debate, that is your first red flag. Because if you cannot name the thing you are passionately arguing against, what exactly are you defending? This is what makes this opening exchange so sharp. The conservative walks in treating wokeism like the greatest cultural threat of our time. But the second, the liberal asks him to name 3 specific woke policies destroying Western culture, complete deflection. He turns it around and says, you define it. You have to understand what is happening here. This is one of the oldest debate maneuvers. If you force the other person to define your term, you spend the next 20 minutes fighting over definitions instead of ever defending your actual position. It is a stall tactic dressed up as intellectual seriousness. Oh, and the liberal catches it immediately. He does not let it slide. He calls it out directly, saying it seems like a really vapid, stupid definition, and that he would just talk about the issue or the policy itself. That is the correct move. You want to debate the actual policy? Fine. But do not come in waving the word wokeism like a battle flag and then refuse to tell anyone what the flag stands for. What is even more revealing is when the conservative tries to distance himself by saying, "Who is us, guys? I am not a conservative." This is something you see constantly. The moment the label becomes inconvenient, suddenly they are above labels entirely. But your positions are what they are regardless of what you call yourself. Here is the part that is genuinely interesting. The liberal eventually gets the conservative to agree that this debate is about whether far-left progressive politics made society worse. Both sides lock in on that definition, and from there the liberal makes a point that is hard to dismiss. Far-left woke politics never had real legislative power. It lived mainly on college campuses and social media. The actual damage to everyday people came from the reaction to those ideas, not from the ideas themselves. Reproductive rights access disappeared across multiple states not because progressives took power, but because of the political backlash those progressive ideas triggered on the other side. That is the argument, and it lands hard.
You're bad. Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
I've worked out the tricks that you play, and so I've trapped you in your own logic.
And to be clear, the trick that I just played was asking you for the definition of a term.
Yes.
Okay, gotcha. All right,
That's
my bad.
right.
I
That's
know that
right.
we don't like that here.
Exactly
okay, my
right.
bad. Okay, go ahead.
That's exactly right. Because what you do is you don't define it yourself, so that you can then argue with my definition for half an hour, and so we can't have the actual debate. Now be quiet, and
I'll define my terms if you want. Well, I'm only going to be quiet. I'll define my terms if you want me to, but wokeism is a term you guys use.
It took me about 10 minutes to get you to define woke. I'm glad we did it. Now we can have the actual discussion.
Now you're going to use my definition. I'm glad I could
now
provide
we
you
can
with
have
one.
the actual
Go for it.
discussion.
Okay.
Now we can have the actual discussion. So if your understanding of the question is, has far-left progressive politics made our societies worse? I completely agree with your definition, and I agree with the premise of the question that it has made things worse for a number of reasons. I mean, the trans thing became a big talking point because it's so ridiculous, not because it's so hugely actually impactful on society, although I do think a small number of children being given puberty blockers and an even smaller number of children being given gender transition surgery is a terrible thing that's happened. I think more broadly, though, I mean, one of the most obvious examples is we now have a society which has, I mean, it's not codified and it's not expressed in, in the, like, no one says publicly we now discriminate against these groups of people, unless occasionally they do. So, for example, the Royal Air Force in this country, when they were in a recruiting drive, they were really struggling to get pilots. And there was a woman there who got fired from the Royal Air Force because she refused to go along with the policy. Her supervisor said to her, "We're not hiring any more useless straight white men." She said, "I don't agree with this policy, it's discriminatory," and she was fired. We've had a system of anti-male, anti-white.
Can I just ask a quick question? So if I would have looked that up, the Royal Air Force had a policy of not hiring straight white men.
I'm not finished yet.
Is that true?
I'm not finished yet.
Okay. I have a feeling it's not, but okay.
So this is something you can look up. It was covered extensively in the news in this country. Probably wasn't covered that well on Wikipedia where you did the research, but...
No, but on The Sun and all of your favorite publications, I'm sure they talked about it a lot.
No, actually it was covered extensively across the mainstream
media. And what they covered was that the Royal Air Force was not hiring straight white men. Well, you seem to respond to some things, but not others. So that wasn't the policy. I can tell because you're not answering that.
That was the policy that was pursued by the Royal Air Force. It was revealed by this whistleblower who was fired for revealing it. The BBC in this country has internships that are not available to white people. We effectively have created a system of passive, tacit, sometimes open discrimination against different groups of people. And one of the reasons that the sort of reactionary sentiment, which you try and paint me as representing, which I don't, is rising in this country and rising quite quickly, including ethno-nationalist sentiment, is because of this. And the reason I opposed wokeness from the very beginning and far-left progressivism from the very beginning was that it was obvious to me that the number one consequence of pursuing radical left-wing progressivism and racial essentialism of this kind would be that the majority population would begin to pursue identity politics for itself. If you discriminate against white men and say so openly, it's going to be a very short period of time before white men look at that and say, well, if we're now picking people for jobs based on skin color, I am the oppressed minority now, or I'm the oppressed majority now. We need to look after my interests. And the reason you see the reactionary forces rising, both in America, in the rest of Europe, and in this country, is precisely because they've been pushed into this corner by woke leftists. And that is one of the major ways that this movement has damaged our society, as I predicted all along.
And then this moment happens. The liberal leans back and says, "I have worked out the tricks that you play and I have trapped you in your own logic." And the conservative goes, "Okay, my bad. Let me explain why that exchange matters so much." Because the liberal immediately follows it up by clarifying that the so-called trick he just pulled was simply asking for a definition of a term. That is IT. That is the whole move. Asking someone to define the word they keep using. The fact that it took nearly 10 full minutes to get there, and the fact that the conservative actually called it a trap, tells you everything about how these conversations normally go. This is actually grounded in a very old intellectual tradition. Socrates built an entire method around this exact approach. Ask someone to define their core term, and watch how fast the argument collapses under its own weight. It is not a trick. It is the foundation of honest intellectual discussion. The liberal did not outsmart anyone with some clever strategy. He just asked a basic question and waited patiently. But here is where the conservative pivots hard. He shifts from the definition battle into his biggest example, the Royal Air Force story. He claims a whistleblower was fired after her supervisor said they were not hiring any more useless straight white men. He then uses this single story to build his broader argument. that discrimination against white men is creating resentment, and that resentment is fueling the rise of reactionary politics across the entire Western world. Now, here is what you have to think about carefully. The conservative is actually making two completely separate claims and treating them as one. First, that this specific incident happened exactly as described. Second, that this one incident represents a system of discrimination that is reshaping political movements continent-wide. Those are very different claims, and the liberal flags it immediately, pointing out that these kinds of stories tend to fall apart when you actually investigate them, and you can feel the defensive energy shift in real time. The conservatives start stacking more examples rapidly: BBC internships, passive discrimination, open discrimination. But notice, he never slows down to actually prove the first claim before moving to the second and third. That is the pattern. Layer the examples fast enough and the audience never gets to question whether any single one of them actually holds up.
So I would say the least impressive thing about conservative predictions is that typically what they'll do is they will build their own enemies, they will cry about the enemies, and then when they manage to convince everybody else that those enemies are real, and then those people react against those enemies, they try to say that, well, it was the enemies in the beginning that caused this particular problem to come about. And I guess the issue that I have is when it comes to woke-related stuff, it's hard to find ever, like, what are the particular DEI policies or affirmative action policies that we're talking about. It's always some vague allusion to airlines don't want to hire white pilots, or they lower their standards for black pilots, or these things that tend to not exist when you actually dig into them. Now, I don't know, maybe it is the case that the Royal Air Force actually had a policy of not hiring straight white men.
It did, yeah.
Okay, I'll look into that. I'm curious about that. I have a feeling when I look into it, it's going to be completely untrue, like most of the stuff that you bring it up. But I'll look into it. Maybe it was true. And, if it is, I would say that's not a good thing, that you shouldn't be doing stuff like that. But I guess the issue I have is when we talk about magnitude, I think you said earlier that sometimes people fixate on these issues a little bit too much, but it's because they're such common sense issues. When I look at the United States right now and I think how many trans people are there, how many people are doing stuff related to trans people, the number of people is incredibly small. It's like 1%. And the idea that that would somehow cause so much of a population to become reactionary that as of 30 minutes ago, I'm pretty sure Iran has tried to bomb like 7 different countries because we have a president who is a madman who is going on a rampage against the entire world insofar as trade and bombs goes. I just can't, in my mind, rationalize how so many of these smart people I'll say in the center like you who say, well, I can obviously identify that this is a problem. Why don't you ever identify any of these super obvious problems on the right, or any of the super obvious problems that are reactionary to the other things that were reactionary, especially when the issues in the United States on the right are represented through every single pylon of power that the conservatives have, and on the left they're in colleges and on Twitter and Facebook and sometimes in AI world on Sora.
This is an article from Sky News. Could you just read out what it says, please?
So I see the AI summary here is applicants.
Read out the headline.
Well, I don't know if this is a headline or if this is a...
Read out the headline.
Okay, so it says, applicants seeking to join RAF described as useless white male pilots in bid to hit impossible diversity targets. Just to be clear, just so I can understand.
Thank you.
Is this headline the same as no straight white men were hired? Or
No.
they had a policy of not hiring straight white men? Wait. I'm just so curious. Do you understand the difference between somebody not being hired because they're white? Because I'm not going to sit here. If you're going to ask me, like, do you think there were ever racist people or even against white people? Of course there are. But you understand there's a difference between the entire Air Force having a policy of not hiring straight white men versus, I guess there was an email where some straight white candidates were skipped over. I don't even know if it was because they didn't meet qualifications or not. They used white men to describe them, but they also called them useless. I don't know if it was because they were white or not. You know there's a difference between those two things, right?
So you don't know this story?
Do you know there's a difference between those two things or no?
Yes, I do. Now,
Okay,
be
thank you.
quiet.
Okay,
Now-
gotcha. Because I was asking for evidence of mine, but you gave me that. So
This is where the whole thing unravels for the conservative side. The liberal makes a point that is genuinely worth sitting with. He says the least impressive thing about conservative predictions is that they build their own enemies, spend years convincing the public those enemies are real, and then when people react against those enemies, they turn around and say, "See, I told you the enemies were dangerous." Think about what that actually means. If you repeat a threat loudly and consistently enough, you manufacture the very reaction you claim to be warning everyone about. That is not a prediction coming true. That is a self-fulfilling cycle, with the alarm being triggered by the person who installed it. And the liberal names this dynamic plainly and without hesitation. Then comes the magnitude argument. And this one deserves real attention. Trans people represent roughly 1% of the population. 1%. And yet that 1% became the central obsession of an entire political movement, consuming debates, driving legislation, crowding out conversations about housing costs, wages, healthcare access, and foreign policy decisions affecting millions of lives. The liberal points out that while the debate about that 1% was absorbing all of the political oxygen in the room, a sitting leader was pursuing an aggressive global economic and military posture that affected virtually every country on Earth. That contrast is not accidental. It is designed to make you ask a very uncomfortable question. What were we actually prioritizing, and who benefited from that prioritization? But the cleanest moment in this entire segment comes right at the end. The conservative pulls out a Sky News article like it is a finishing move. He presents it with full confidence. The liberal reads the headline back calmly. Applicants seeking to join the RAF described as useless white male pilots in a bid to hit diversity targets, and then asks one simple question. Is this headline the same as the Air Force having an official policy of not hiring straight white men? Silence. Because there is a difference. There is a massive difference between an individual using careless and discriminatory language in one specific situation and an institution operating under a formal written policy of exclusion. Conflating those two things is not analysis. It is emotional storytelling dressed up as evidence. When the liberal identifies the gap between those two things, names it clearly, and the conservative responds with, "Okay, thank you, gotcha." That right there is the sound of an argument ending. Not with a dramatic explosion, just a quiet, uncomfortable acknowledgement that the evidence did not actually say what it was presented to say. And that is what real accountability in a debate looks like. Not volume, not speed. Just one precise, well-timed question that exposes the distance between what was claimed and what was proven. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.